Monthly payments are everywhere. Housing, cars, phones, software, education, even everyday services are now framed through a single question. How much per month? The logic sounds practical. Large prices become manageable. Access feels democratized. Instead of confronting a daunting total cost, the burden is sliced into portions that appear compatible with a normal paycheck. This framing feels reasonable because it aligns with how most people experience money in daily life. Income arrives monthly, bills are due monthly, budgets are planned monthly. In that sense, monthly payments seem to mirror reality rather than distort it. They promise control, predictability, and calm. Nothing about the structure feels reckless or extreme. On the surface, it looks like a neutral tool for smoothing financial life. Yet this apparent rationality starts to wobble when examined through financial logic rather than emotional comfort. A system can feel stable at the level of a single month while becoming fragile across years. What appears affordable in isolation may be costly when aggregated over time. The monthly frame narrows attention to immediacy and obscures the full shape of the commitment being entered. This is not a story about irresponsibility or poor individual choices. The behavior is too widespread, too normalized, and too consistently encouraged to be explained by personal failure. When a pattern repeats across income levels, age groups, and cultures, it points to design rather than character. The question is not why people accept monthly payments, but why the system insists on presenting prices this way in the first place. The more dominant monthly framing becomes, the more it reshapes intuition about value, risk, and affordability. It trains people to evaluate decisions based on short-term comfort instead of long-term structure. Over time, the total cost fades into abstraction, while the monthly figure becomes the primary reality. This raises a structural question that often goes unasked. When financial decisions are filtered through monthly affordability, what parts of the cost are being postponed, blurred, or made invisible, and who ultimately carries them when the timeline extends beyond the present moment? A common reaction to the prevalence of monthly payments is to explain it through individual behavior. People are said to lack discipline, to overconsume, or to misunderstand basic math. The story is familiar. If consumers were more patient, more rational, or more educated, the problem would largely disappear. This explanation feels intuitive because it assigns cause and responsibility at the personal level. But this framing collapses under scale. Monthly payment structures are used by people with very different incomes, education levels, and risk profiles. They are adopted not at the margins, but at the center of modern consumption. When a financial pattern becomes the default option rather than a niche choice, individual weakness is no longer a sufficient explanation. What we are observing is not a series of isolated mistakes, but a coordinated environment in which certain choices are consistently made easier, smoother, and more socially acceptable than their alternatives. Blaming consumers also misses a crucial point. The system is designed to be navigated quickly and emotionally, not analytically. Prices are rarely presented in ways that invite long-horizon comparison. Instead, attention is guided toward immediate affordability, minimal friction, and perceived normalcy. Within such an environment, choosing a monthly payment plan is not a deviation from rational behavior. It is the path of least resistance. This does not absolve individuals of agency, but it reframes where the leverage truly lies. When outcomes are predictable at scale, the driver is structure, not personality. To understand why monthly payments dominate, the analysis must shift away from personal shortcomings and toward the rules, incentives, and presentation methods that shape decisions before conscious evaluation even begins. To understand the dominance of monthly payments, the frame of analysis has to change. As long as decisions are evaluated through how they feel in the moment, the structure remains invisible. The shift is from perception to architecture, from immediate comfort to the full financial timeline that a decision quietly commits to. Monthly pricing encourages a narrow unit of measurement. By isolating one payment period, it fragments a single obligation into seemingly independent events. Each month appears manageable on its own, which discourages the mind from reconstructing the whole. The financial reality, however, does not operate in fragments. Costs accumulate continuously, regardless of how they are labeled or scheduled. This is why a time-based reframing matters. Looking only at the current month answers a different question than looking at the entire life cycle of the commitment. The first asks whether today's cash flow can absorb the payment. The second asks how long resources will remain tied up, what flexibility is surrendered, and what future choices are implicitly foreclosed. These are structural questions, not emotional ones. Once the frame widens, a more precise inquiry becomes possible. Who is carrying the cost, and when is that cost actually paid? Monthly payments often relocate financial weight away from the present and into the future, where it feels less tangible and less urgent. The price of access is not eliminated, it is deferred. The burden does not vanish, it is redistributed across time. This reframing does not judge the choice itself. Instead, it exposes the mechanics that make certain choices appear lighter than they are. By shifting attention from, "Can I afford this month?" to, "What does this bind me to over time?" the analysis moves from surface-level affordability to the underlying structure that governs financial durability. The illusion created by monthly payments does not arise from a single trick. It is the result of several layers working together, each reinforcing the others. When examined closely, the structure reveals itself as a coordinated system that reshapes how cost, time, and responsibility are perceived. At the first layer are the financial tools and rules that govern how prices are presented. Monthly payment systems fragment a total obligation into smaller units, and then foreground those units as if they were the price itself. The full cost is rarely hidden, but it is repositioned into the background, stripped of urgency. Interest, service fees, administrative charges, and long-term commitments are either delayed, renamed, or normalized as routine. What matters structurally is not deception in the narrow sense, but reordering. By changing the sequence in which costs are encountered, the system ensures that the most psychologically tolerable number appears first, while the most consequential numbers are encountered later, if at all. The economic substance remains intact, but its visibility is reduced. This fragmentation also alters the meaning of affordability. Instead of asking whether a good or service is expensive relative to value, the question becomes whether the monthly cash outflow fits within a current budget. Affordability shifts from a measure of total burden to a measure of short-term compatibility. In doing so, the system redefines what it means to pay for something. Payment becomes an ongoing condition rather than a completed act, and cost becomes a background process rather than a decisive moment. The second layer operates at the level of human psychology. People do not naturally experience time as a neutral continuum. Immediate costs feel heavier than distant ones, and recurring small amounts feel lighter than single large ones, even when the totals are identical. Monthly payments align perfectly with these tendencies. They minimize immediate discomfort while maximizing acceptance. By synchronizing obligations with familiar income cycles, they create a sense of normalcy and control. The mind interprets regularity as stability, even when the underlying commitment is rigid or long-term. There is also a cognitive separation between decision and consequence. The act of agreeing to a monthly payment plan feels brief and contained, while the consequences unfold slowly, dispersed across months or years. This temporal gap weakens emotional feedback. Because no single payment feels decisive, no single moment triggers a reassessment of the total commitment. Over time, the obligation becomes part of the background noise of life, rarely questioned unless disrupted by income instability or external shock. Importantly, this psychological response is not a flaw unique to certain individuals. It is a predictable human pattern. When a system consistently produces the same behavior across populations, it is evidence of design alignment with cognition. Monthly payments succeed not because people are careless, but because the structure is calibrated to how people actually perceive time, effort, and loss. The third layer concerns who benefits from this alignment. When consumers focus primarily on monthly figures, providers gain several advantages. Long-term commitments stabilize revenue streams and reduce volatility. Deferred costs reduce friction at the point of sale, increasing conversion and uptake. Once an obligation is spread across time, exit becomes more complex, often involving penalties, sunk costs, or loss of access. This increases customer retention without requiring ongoing persuasion. From a systemic perspective, the benefit is not simply higher profit per transaction, but predictability. Predictable cash flows are more valuable than uncertain ones, especially at scale. Monthly payment structures convert discretionary spending into quasi-fixed obligations. What was once optional becomes embedded. This shifts risk asymmetrically. Income uncertainty remains with the individual, while revenue certainty accrues to the institution. Crucially, this does not require malicious intent. A system can generate imbalance without overt exploitation. Incentives alone are sufficient. When one side gains stability and optionality while the other absorbs rigidity and exposure to future uncertainty, the structure naturally reproduces itself. Competing providers adopt similar models to remain competitive, further entrenching the norm. Over time, monthly framing stops appearing as a choice and starts appearing as the default. These three layers reinforce one another. Financial tools make costs easier to accept, psychology explains why they are accepted, and institutional incentives explain why the structure persists and spreads. The illusion is not that monthly payments are cheap, but that they are light. Weight is not removed, it is redistributed across time in a way that dulls perception. Understanding this mechanism does not require assigning blame. It requires recognizing that what feels reasonable at the level of a single month may be structurally misaligned with long-term financial resilience. When cost is experienced incrementally but obligation is total, perception and reality diverge. The system functions smoothly precisely because this divergence remains largely unexamined. Viewed in isolation, a monthly payment often appears benign. In the short term, the transaction feels balanced. Access is granted, cash flow remains intact, and there is little immediate disruption to daily life. The payment integrates smoothly into existing routines, joining rent, utilities, and subscriptions as another predictable line item. At this stage, the structure feels stable precisely because nothing seems to change. Over the medium term, however, the shape of the commitment begins to matter more than any single payment. Months accumulate, and with them, obligations stack. What once felt flexible starts to harden. The number of future months already spoken for increases, reducing the margin for adjustment. While each payment remains unchanged, the context around it shifts. New opportunities must now be evaluated against an already committed future cash flow. The system does not announce this transition, it emerges gradually, almost invisibly. This is where the divergence between subjective experience and objective reality becomes clearer. Subjectively, the individual often feels consistent, the payment is the same, the routine is familiar, and nothing appears to have worsened. Objectively, however, the financial position has become more constrained. The relevant variable is no longer the size of the payment, but the duration of its claim on future income. Time, rather than money, becomes the scarce resource. In the long term, the structure reveals its full character. The cumulative effect of many, manageable, payments is a future that is increasingly pre-allocated. Flexibility diminishes not because of a single large mistake, but because of sustained exposure to long commitments. When circumstances change, income volatility, health issues, shifts in priorities, the rigidity of the obligation becomes visible. What once felt light now feels heavy, not because the amount increased, but because the ability to adapt decreased. This temporal progression highlights a critical asymmetry. The emotional experience remains anchored to the present, while the financial reality unfolds across time. Short-term comfort masks long-term binding. The system rewards continuity, not reassessment. Because no single moment feels decisive, there is rarely a clear point at which the structure invites reflection. Comparing perception and reality makes the gap explicit. Perception focuses on stability, predictable payments, uninterrupted access, and the absence of immediate strain. Reality reflects accumulation, extended obligations, reduced optionality, and exposure to future uncertainty. The two are not aligned in time. One is experienced monthly, the other is realized cumulatively. This misalignment is not accidental. It is a property of the structure itself. By distributing cost over time while consolidating commitment upfront, the system ensures that discomfort is minimized early and concentrated later. The result is a pattern where decisions feel reversible in the moment but prove sticky over years. The timeline, not the payment amount, is where the true cost reveals itself. The most consequential costs of monthly payment structures are rarely the ones that appear on a statement. They are not labeled as fees, interest, or charges, and they do not arrive on a predictable schedule. Instead, they take the form of constraints that emerge only when circumstances change. One such cost is the erosion of optionality. When future income is already allocated to ongoing obligations, the ability to respond to new information diminishes. Opportunities that require flexibility, changing jobs, relocating, investing time in retraining, or absorbing short-term income gaps, become harder to pursue. These are not expenses in the traditional sense, yet they carry real economic weight. The system does not charge for them upfront, but it extracts their value over time. Another invisible cost lies in risk concentration. Monthly payments assume continuity, stable income, stable health, stable priorities. When reality deviates from that assumption, the structure reveals its fragility. The risk of disruption remains with the individual, while the obligation remains fixed. This asymmetry is rarely highlighted at the point of commitment because it does not fit within the monthly framing. Risk exists, but it is displaced into the future, where it feels abstract and unlikely. There is also a cognitive cost. As obligations accumulate, mental bandwidth narrows. Decisions are increasingly filtered through existing commitments, reducing the space for strategic thinking. Financial life becomes about maintenance rather than choice. This shift is subtle and gradual, which makes it difficult to identify until it is already well established. The largest danger of these invisible costs is not immediate financial strain, but path dependence. Once a large portion of future cash flow is spoken for, choices begin to compound in one direction. Reversing course becomes expensive, not necessarily in money, but in lost flexibility. Monthly payments feel harmless precisely because these costs do not announce themselves. Yet over time, they shape the range of futures that remain accessible, long after the initial decision has faded from attention. When monthly payment structures move from being an option to becoming the norm, their effects extend beyond individual decisions and begin to reshape the system itself. What was once a financing method gradually becomes a pricing language. Goods and services are no longer designed around their total value, but around the monthly figure that the market will tolerate. As this framing spreads, benchmarks shift. A product is perceived as affordable, not because its total cost is low, but because its monthly payment aligns with prevailing expectations. This creates an upward pressure on total prices while preserving the appearance of accessibility. Risk is not eliminated, it is normalized. Long-term commitments become standard, and carrying multiple overlapping obligations feels ordinary rather than exceptional. At the collective level, this normalization has consequences. When a large share of the population is bound by fixed monthly obligations, the system becomes more sensitive to shocks. Income volatility, economic downturns, or structural changes in labor markets translate more quickly into widespread strain. Yet because the obligations were entered gradually and individually, the resulting fragility is often misinterpreted as a series of personal failures rather than a systemic exposure. Monthly framing also redistributes uncertainty. Institutions gain predictability through stable cash flows, while individuals absorb the variability of life events. Over time, this asymmetry becomes embedded in how markets function. Flexibility is privatized as a luxury, while rigidity is distributed as a default condition. The critical shift is not behavioral but cultural. When everyone speaks in monthly terms, the long horizon fades from public conversation. Decisions that bind years of future income are evaluated with tools designed for short-term comfort. The system does not collapse under this logic, but it becomes less resilient. What feels normal at the surface gradually encodes vulnerability beneath it. Monthly payments persist not because they are irrational, but because they are structurally persuasive. They translate complex, long-term obligations into a format that feels familiar, manageable, and emotionally neutral. In doing so, they shift attention away from durability and toward immediacy, away from total commitment and toward short-term comfort. The tension, then, is not between discipline and indulgence, but between perception and structure. What feels reasonable within the boundaries of a single month may be misaligned with financial stability across years. This misalignment does not announce itself loudly. It operates quietly through norms, defaults, and repeated acceptance. Understanding this does not require rejecting the system outright. It requires recognizing that the rules are not neutral. When affordability is defined by the month, responsibility is stretched across time, and the future quietly absorbs today's decisions. The open question is not whether monthly payments make life easier, but what kind of financial landscape they create when the present is consistently prioritized over the horizon that follows.